We have a really fascinating guest today, and that's Chief Josh Bruegger from the Pasadena, not California, from the Pasadena, Texas Police Department. Chief, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Chief, everybody thinks Texas is all, sheriffs with mustaches and law and order, and there's no, crime and all that. And yet you dealt with an issue that everybody else kind of associates with New York City. And that's the terrible reality of how dangerous bail reform is. Can you talk about that, Chief?
Yeah, so I took office as chief in January of 2019. And really my first introduction to bail, I always tell people, I've been a chief about 11 days, and I have a line of officers outside my door, and they were upset about something. And long story short is they had arrested the night before a suspect for aggravated robbery. He had held up a series of drugstores at gunpoint. And then we caught him leaving the scene of the last one. And as he was running, he turned and pointed a gun at one of the officers who hit him with a car. And so he gets arrested for 4 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of aggravated assault on a police officer, and he got a PR bond.
And so tell people what a PR bond is, because this is a really dangerous, violent guy, right?
Yes. So it's personal recognizance bond. Essentially, it's your verbal promise that you're going to come back to court when you're supposed to be there. And you sign saying you're going to come back, and you're released without any surety, anything, and basically let out the back door of the jail.
So I mean, the fact that you've committed multiple robberies, you've attacked police officers, all that. I mean, why wouldn't you follow the law and show up in court, right, Chief?
Right. I mean, what do you have to lose at that point? So that really was my first introduction. And I always tell people that because I was really naive about this whole bail reform and how it was going to impact me. And so if here I am, a police chief that's really ignorant at the time, to be honest with you, about really how this was going to impact me. I just imagine with the rest of the public, they have no idea what's going on right underneath their noses.
So this dangerous, violent felon gets out on his own signature, and you guys just sort of have to hope he doesn't reoffend, right? But that's not what happened.
Right. And on this particular case, the FBI saw the story, the FBI ended up picking it up, but then fast forward about 6 months later, and that really was my second introduction to bail reform and the negative impact it can have. And that was, it was a Saturday evening. I remember very distinctly where I was at, and I got a phone call from our violent crimes investigators, and they were telling me, Chief, you're not going to believe this. And I said, try me. So they had told me just a couple days earlier, we had arrested a guy who had assaulted his wife. So he was arrested for family violence. He had also killed the family cat. And that was part of the investigation that they were considering taking charges later, but they wanted a little bit more investigation done on that. But regardless, he was arrested for assaulting his wife, who was pregnant at the time. And he was already out on 2 PR bonds at the time, his second DWI offense and leaving the scene of a crash. So here he is out on 2 PR bonds. We arrest him about 6 weeks after that for a assault family member on his wife. He turns around and gets another PR bond. And then about 18 hours later, returned to the apartment and killed his wife. And she was 4 months pregnant, and killed their unborn child. So that was really my introduction to, this revolving door of PR bonds and how dangerous it can be.
When we talk about domestic violence, what you just described is the situation that we all fear, that we have a violent offender that we arrest and we are forced to let them out on bond. Because what people need to understand, the police don't set the bond. That's the court that does that. And our whole goal with domestic violence is to keep that offender away from the spouse. And as we all know, the most dangerous time for that victim, and in this case, a young pregnant woman, the most dangerous time for her is right when he gets out of jail. He's angry, and there's a real good chance he's going to reoffend. And that's exactly what happened in her case, her horrible, sad case, right, Chief?
Absolutely. And to me, the system truly failed this family in this case. And that's the unfortunate part. And the officers that go out there every day trying to do the right thing and trying to protect the victim, trying to, make the arrest, all those things that we do, to protect a victim, and then to turn around and, the system to fail, and have this tragic, horrible outcome. I mean, it's sad.
So this young woman gets murdered by her domestic partner. And I can't even imagine. I got to just talk about your officers and your detectives for a minute. They must have been just devastated. Is that right?
They were, because they had just been out there, and I say we're a big agency, but we're also small enough that everybody really knows everything that's going on. And so, just to think, officers, again, just, it was about 2 days earlier, had been out there, had talked to her, and, all of those things. And again, we do all the things that we can to protect her. And it does have an impact on the officers. It has an emotional impact. It makes them angry. And just the human side of things is, officers, after a while, it's like, why do we want to do the right thing if the system's going to fail on the back end? And that's a challenge to me, as a leader in law enforcement right now, is with everything that's going on in the world around us, to continue to, encourage, the good men and women out there in law enforcement to continue to go out there and do the job. And that's the tough part right now.
So after this occurred, and now you've got a homicide on your hands, and you're, everybody's busy with that. One of the things that you have to do is deal with that young woman's family. And you got to know her mom. Is that right?
That's right. And her mom has, she's been a huge ally, and she's really, trying to push forward some legislation to bring people's attention to what's going on. And, in the days and months, following this, I'm out in the community a lot, speak at a lot of community events, and these two cases that I've talked about here, they garner quite a bit of media attention. And so when I would be out speaking, I can't tell you how many times people, citizens would say, well, what do we do about these judges? And the diplomatic part of me, is like, y'all elected them. It's the people don't even really understand the process that, they just elected these folks. And it's like, well, what do we do about it? I said, you got to show up and vote, but that's, I say that to say that I think there's a lot of confusion, with the criminal justice system. People really don't understand what's going on. I say the general public, and are just naive to it until they're, impacted by it. And so Caitlin's mom, is really pushing a law, Caitlin's Law right now, to try to shore up some of these gaps that's happening with bail reform. And, the one thing I always tell people is I'm not necessarily against PR bonds in limited situations, but to me, if you've already got one, you don't get another one. Violent crime is another one. I don't think we should be giving PR bonds for violent crime. I think the thing we lose with the PR bonds is the accountability, right? That if somebody comes down and posts your bond, that in addition to being accountable to the court and to the bail bondsman, you're also going to be accountable to that person who posted your bail. And so I think we're losing some of those layers of accountability with this bail reform.
So explain that to people, because I don't know that people necessarily understand. When the police put somebody in jail, a bail is set, and it's a certain amount of money that someone has to put up, whether it's a family member, a relative, a bail bondsman. And then that money is held not by the police, it's held by the courts until that person returns to court and does everything that they're supposed to do. So explain how that personal recognizance bond changes that $100,000 bail, $50,000 bail. I mean, what's said is said, but how does that get changed?
Because they literally are just let out on their signature and their word that they're going to return. And some of these people, some of these offenses, I question whether they're going to return, especially they've already gotten PR bonds. And so that to me is where we got to get that accountability back in the system, because we're missing it right now. And the thing I was talking to somebody not long ago, we were talking about, an 18-year-old kid that gets arrested for a very small amount of marijuana. When mom and dad go down there and they sign that bail, or sign that, with the bail bondsman, and they put up the, $50, $100, and the bail bondsman puts up the rest of it, you still have that accountability that they now have to answer to their parents. And, when their parents have put that money up in this situation I was giving you, mom and dad are going to make sure that, the 18-year-old kid gets to court. Whereas if the kid's just signing and walking out the door, again, I think you're losing a layer of, just that accountability from friends, family members, whoever is helping. And so, I think you're less accountable in that situation.
After her murder, were your officers and your investigators able to successfully investigate that crime?
They were. In the tragic part of it is he actually called 911 after he killed her, and told the 911 operator that he had killed her. And so the responding officers got there, and he came out of the apartment, was covered in blood, and he made some statements, to the effect that if, because obviously they were having marital problems, that if he couldn't raise the child, that nobody was going to. And like I said, he had stabbed her over 20 times. So it was a violent, brutal murder. But he was charged with capital murder, and he's still sitting in jail, awaiting disposition on that. And the ironic thing in this bail reform here in Harris County is relatively new, and so there's a lot of stat keeping and a lot of data collection that's going on. So I guess the interesting thing, if you will, is so he's charged with capital murder and he was held on no bond on that. They reinstated his PR bonds on the assault family member, the DWI, and the fail to stop and give information. So I can't help but think that that's to make it look like there isn't, bond forfeitures on those cases. So I think there's some, you have to be careful with stats and with data. And that's the one thing that I've realized in all of this is you can play games with the numbers. And so you really have to, dive into the numbers when people are telling you that, it's been a success or it's been a failure. Either way, you really got to look at the numbers and figure out what's going on with them.
I would imagine that your citizens were outraged by this situation. Is that true?
Yeah, they were. And, I think that's the interesting thing about this is, unfortunately, we live in a very political country right now, very divided. I always, it's very binary, you're either here or here, and there is nobody in the middle. And the one thing I found when I was out in the community, in the days and months after this is there was, I would say, an overwhelming outrage in our community. Didn't matter if they're rich, poor, white, black, Hispanic. It was a cross section of folks that were appalled, offended at what had happened. And we have a very active department social media page and our Facebook page, and we had posted about this story right after it happened. And the ironic thing is we had people that got on there and self-identified as, I've been in prison before, I've been in jail before, and this is crazy that these people are getting PR bonds. I never got that. And so you have people that have been through the system that, even were offended that this was going on. So again, I think that's the unique thing is everybody wants to be safe. Again, no matter where you're at in the, in the socioeconomic scale, whatever race you are, people want to be safe.
Well, and quite frankly, the people who are in the poorest of the poor communities, they tend to be the most vulnerable to the criminals. And that's why now, we've been hearing at first we heard the abolish the police movement, immediately post George Floyd in Minneapolis. That has kind of transitioned now into the defund the police movement. And yet the Rasmussen polling organization just came out with a poll that said 66% of adults in this country, voters, absolutely oppose reducing the funding of any of their police departments. That's up 59% from the same poll they did in June. People are starting to realize that defunding the police is not such a great idea. What are you seeing and hearing in your community, Chief?
So we have a very supportive community, but we have neighboring agencies that aren't so lucky. And, like you just said, I think that the thing to me that's the most sad about all this is the communities that are going to suffer are those ones that need us the most. And the ones that already, oftentimes the minority communities, the impoverished, parts of the community, that the defund talk, those are the ones that are going to end up suffering. And so those communities that are already having, oftentimes crime problems and other problems that they're only going to get worse through defunding. They're not going to get better. And so that's the unfortunate part. As somebody told me the other day, they said, the affluent, suburban communities, if they defund the police, they've got the money, to private security, those types of things where, the inner city often doesn't have that. And so again, they're just going to be victimized even more. And that's what scares me.
Well, and I think for a department like yours, very similar to the department I worked on, I'm guessing you have a lot of community policing programs, officers in the schools. I mean, you get out there with your community, even you, and you're the chief. If your budget was slashed, what would happen to those community policing programs, Chief?
Something's got to give, and that's where you got to make, you got to start making tough decisions. And people are still going to want you to respond when they call, and so that's where I would think as a chief, that's where you're going to have to put all your manpower. And so all those extra assignments that you have, those community engagement, that to me is where the cuts are going to happen. And I think if you look all the way back even to Ferguson, the one thing I always tell my folks is we've got to have that built up good collateral with our community before an event happens. Because if you don't, I mean, I think if you look at Ferguson, you see what happened there. And so I always tell folks it's kind of like a bank account. Well, we always have to make deposits into that account, those positive interactions with the community, because here's the reality. We have 300 cops, 300 individuals. It doesn't matter how well we train, all those things. At some point, hopefully it's not anytime soon, but at some point there's a chance that one of the men or women here could make a poor decision. And so when that happens, you've got to have that credibility with your community so that they can look at your agency and say, okay, well, that may have happened, but that's not who they are because, of all these things in our history with our community. And so to me, that's important. And if we are cutting and slashing, you're going to lose those opportunities to build those relationships with your community.
I recently took a look at Austin's police budget there in Austin, Texas. And they have, their city council has done some voting to slash their budget. And when I looked at the programs that are going to be cut, it's almost entirely community policing programs. And yet when we hear that term, police reform, or, we also hear reimagining the police. When we reimagine the police, we're talking about community policing, something that we've been doing in the United States since the 1970s, since I was a kid. And yet those programs are all going to go away if we don't have the funding for them. And that's what I really want people to understand. That's why the National Police Association, we're out there with PSAs and social media trying to get people to understand what defunding the police really means. It's not positive for anybody. And Chief, we were talking before we went on the air about some of the larger cities, like for example, Minneapolis. Their chief recently had to tell the members of the community and the businesses who are asking for help in some of these just decimated neighborhoods. The chief basically has to say, you know what? We just can't, we don't have the resources to help you. How, as a police leader, how heartbreaking would it be for you to have to tell your community something like that?
I could only imagine because, I think back to when I started and, most men and women, when they started, it's to make a difference in the community. And when you don't have the resources, you can't make that difference. And so to see people that are in need, are hurting, and want help, and you just can't do it because you don't have the resources anymore. And I always tell people, decisions have consequences, good and bad. And so, when people are making these decisions, especially reform, that's one of the things that I've been preaching is we need thoughtful decisions. We need to look at, long-term, what's going to happen if we make this decision, because right now, I unfortunately see a lot of communities, making decisions really in the heat of the moment to try to, appease people, jump up and down. Hey, look what we did. But they're not looking at the long-term implications of their decisions. And, unfortunately, they're starting to come to fruition already. It's only been a couple months since George Floyd, and look at, what's happened in Minneapolis in just that short amount of time. So, I hate to think, 6 more months, a year from now, what that's going to look like if they stay on the same course.
Chief, how do you think police leaders around the nation can help hold the line on the defunding the police movement? What do we need to hear from our police leaders?
So I think this is education. I think this is getting people out there, and I think one of our fights right now is, the media narrative that's out there, to be honest with you, is that's a hard sell. This murder case I talked about here a minute ago, it didn't get a lot of media attention. I figured that, more people, because they would be outraged, would get that attention. And so it is our job to get out there and to educate people so that they understand, the consequences of their decisions.
And gosh, that seems sad, right? Everybody loves to replay a salacious 5-second video of an officer involved shooting, but they don't want to hear about the murder of a young pregnant woman murdered by her own partner.
Right.
And the loss that her mom is experiencing is just unthinkable. But people, there's that reform the police movement that wants to paint us all as bad, as people who get up every morning and want to hunt down people of color and engage them in a deadly force confrontation. And that's just not the case. What is it that you guys are doing in Pasadena? How are you getting that community support? Because clearly you have it.
That's it's really preaching to the line officers. And right now, I think the natural tendency for officers in a climate like this, even in a city like ours where we're supported by the police, is to turn inward, kind of circle the wagons inward. And that's really been my push is at a time like this, we cannot turn our back on our community. They have supported us through thick and thin, good and bad, and we owe it to them to continue to give them the service that they deserve. And it's building those relationships, as I say, one contact at a time. I'm big on explaining reasons for stops, traffic stops. It's most people's interaction with the police and taking it, take to that next level, explaining it to people, allowing people to be heard, all of those things that are really important for people to view your department as legitimate. We have a lot of community-based programs. And so again, any opportunity we can to interact with our community outside of a law enforcement role, it just builds that relationship. And, I'm pretty proud of what we have here.
You should be. And Chief, we need people to understand that, yes, there's lots of talk about reforming the justice system as well. And yet your community, unfortunately, has seen the most tragic result of one of those reforms, and that's bail reform. Chief Bruegger, we cannot thank you enough for spending time with us and helping to explain why defunding the police is a bad idea for law enforcement, and it's a bad idea for the American public. And if you would like more information about the National Police Association and our initiatives, go to nationalpolice.org.